So welcome everyone to this webinar on FAIR Vocabularies in Population Research, which serves as a launch event and an opportunity to discuss the report of the same name, which was produced by a joint IUSSP, which is the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population, and CODATA, which is the Committee on Data of the International Science Council, a joint working group of those two organizations, and which was chaired by George Alter and co-chaired by Steve McEachen and Arafin Gregory. I'll give fuller introductions of those people shortly. I'm Simon Hodson, Executive Director of CODATA. I'm going to chair the early part of the webinar. So first some housekeeping, then introduction to speakers, and then I'll say a few words on behalf of CODATA about why this report and the activity of the working group is important. So first, some housekeeping. As you will have heard, the webinar is being recorded. The recording and the presentations will be made available shortly after. Everyone is muted, but we will allow you to unmute when we get onto the discussion part. Please use the chat tool to post any questions in advance, and ideally mark them with the word question in capital letters so they're easy for us to see. Now I'll introduce the speakers. The first speaker will be George Alter from the University of Michigan, who was as I said, the chair and the lead author of the report, FAIR Vocabularies in Population Research. We will also hear from one of the prominent members of the working group, Abdullah Gozalov from the United Nations Statistical Division, who will talk about statistical data and metadata exchange, the SDMX format, which is important in these discussions. Then we'll hear from Steve McEachen, who's the director of the Australian Data Archive and was also, as I said, co-chair of the working group and is an officer of CODATA. And then finally, we'll hear from Edith Gray, who is an IUSSP Council member, who will close the presentation part of the meeting with some reflections on why this is important for IUSSP, and I hope also will answer the question, what will IUSSP do with the recommendations? And then we'll have a discussion which will be chaired by one of the other co-chairs of the working group, Arafin Gregory, who has roles with both CODATA and the DDI Alliance, which is an important part of the landscape of social science metadata specifications. So that's the menu for the next 90 minutes. I'll just say a few words about CODATA and why we're interested in this work. So as I said, CODATA is the Committee on Data of the International Science Council. We work across a number of domains, and principally to promote international collaboration to advance open science and to improve the availability and usability of data for all areas of research. And that means currently that we're particularly concerned, as well as with open science, with the FAIR principles, with the idea that data and metadata relating to them should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. I'm sure many people are familiar with the FAIR principles. And as the Committee on Data of the International Science Council, we have a particular mission to work with international scientific organizations, which are themselves members of the ISC, of the International Science Council. And those two missions, advancing FAIR and working with members of the International Science Councils, come together in this working group and in this report. So briefly, a little bit of history. In the shock and of the aftermath of the First World War, and in some of the determination to encourage international cooperation, in the years that followed the First World War, a number of international scientific unions were formed, many of them in 1919, and IUSSP in 1928, or at least tracing its roots to 1928. And at the same time, the forerunner of the International Science Council was formed in 1919, and it's gone under different names over the history of the 20th century and the early 21st century, a lot of those international scientific organizations.
Simon, you just muted.
I have no idea why that was. Perhaps someone thought I'd gone on already too long. I'll finish what I have to say as quickly as possible. A lot of the work of those early international scientific unions was precisely concerned with international coordination around nomenclatures, terminologies, vocabularies, what you will, shared definitions of the concepts that were essential for particular fields of research. Much later when, and you can see how important that is for the mission of international scientific organizations like that, and how that mission needs to evolve in the early 21st century, where we need those terminologies to be online and accessible by humans and by the machines that they use to create data, to analyze data, etc. CODATA in turn started off with a relatively limited focus on the physical and chemical sciences, which has broadened in the history of CODATA, sometimes with a degree of resistance from CODATA itself. But from the 1990s, we've been very much concerned with social sciences and with geography, geographical sciences, etc. In 2017, as the two organizations which came together to form the International Science Council agreed on that process, CODATA was asked to prepare what we call a decadal program, an activity which became part of the International Science Council's action plan. And the purpose of that activity was explicitly to look at interdisciplinary or cross-domain interoperability and FAIR. So it's entitled Making Data Work for Cross-Domain Grand Challenges. We held a series of workshops, and this in turn led to a close collaboration with the DDI Alliance, which I've already mentioned, and a series of workshops hosted at the Leibniz Foundation's Dargstuhl Center in Germany. And at one of those meetings at the Dargstuhl Center, an ad hoc group led by Simon Cox, then of CSIRO in Australia, formed and produced the article 10 Simple Rules for Making Vocabularies Fair. And that, in turn, the publication of that article, in turn, led to the creation of this working group. George, I think it's fair to say, read the article and thought, we really should do something along these lines for terminologies, for vocabularies in population sciences and demography. So from a CODATA perspective, that sort of work involving direct partnerships with unions, international scientific unions, or similar representative scientific organizations that are global in scope, is exactly what we're supposed to be doing. And a number of similar activities are underway as part of the decadal program, which I've mentioned, and the World Fair project, which is a European Commission funded project coordinated by CODATA. And it's our conviction, the conviction of CODATA in that activity, that international scientific unions and other similar bodies that can claim to represent a given research discipline in an authoritative way are essential to bring consensus around the components of FAIR, and in particular, terminologies, concepts, etc. That's expressed very clearly in recommendation 4 of the report, Turning FAIR into Reality, which says that particular research domains need to be empowered to reflect upon how they turn their practices, how they adapt their practices for the 21st century, and how they turn their metadata, their terminologies, etc., into FAIR metadata and terminologies. And I think that the work that's gone on in this working group is an excellent example of that. So I hope those messages of why CODATA is interested in the origins of the working group are of interest and are useful to understand what comes next. We will be very keen to discuss other opportunities and partnerships to do similar work with other domains and other representative organizations. And with that, I'll hand over to George for the first presentation. George, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Wrong one. Let's see. Sorry. There we go. So I trust everyone can see my slides now. And thank you very much, Simon, for the introduction and for setting the background for the work we've been doing. So we set up the working group really based on the 10 Simple Rules article, and the goal simply is to make demographic data more interoperable by publishing controlled vocabularies that can be found and acted upon by software. And I'll explain that. I had terrific help from Arifin and Steve, and from 20 other participants who worked very hard, especially Abdallah and some others from his community. So I'm very conscious that we have two sponsors, IUSSP and CODATA, who come from quite different scientific communities, demography on one hand and data science on the other. So the report and what I'm going to do today actually has two kinds of narratives. One is to explain what FAIR means to demographers, and also to explain demography, but more importantly, the infrastructure of demographic data to data scientists. And at the end of the report, we have recommendations for IUSSP, for CODATA, and for other stakeholders. So FAIR comes from an article that proposed a set of guidelines for making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. These are the 4 steps in sharing data and making data more usable and shareable, not only within domains but also across domains. If you, although the name FAIR implies that making sort of data equity, that's certainly part of what FAIR is about, but FAIR is also about making data more machine friendly. What most people who've studied it find is that researchers spend enormous amounts of time wrangling with data to make it fit together. And FAIR is about ways that we can automate some of those processes. That the two things that I want to emphasize about that are that FAIR is very much about metadata. That is to say, the descriptive information that tells you what's in data and the meaning of data. And FAIR also relies very heavily on persistent identifiers. Persistent identifiers are references that machines can look up to find things. And normally persistent identifiers point to a place on the internet that has both a landing page that humans can understand and is machine readable. So why are we focusing on FAIR vocabularies? What we mean by FAIR vocabularies is controlled vocabularies that create standards for how things are described. There are many such vocabularies that are used in demography and most other fields. But FAIR vocabularies allow machines to answer some very basic questions. For example, when two data sets have measures that look like they're the same thing, are they really the same thing? If those measures are tagged with persistent identifiers, not only can a person see that they're the same thing, a machine can see that they're the same as well. Similarly, if you think about measures in demography, demographers know that there are subtle differences between a crude birth rate, a general fertility rate, a total fertility rate. Well, machines can't read the articles or the PDF to see which one is which, but machines can use standards that can explain how these things are related. There are 4 use cases that we discuss in the report about FAIR vocabularies: data discovery, that is to say, using FAIR vocabularies to navigate catalogs, to link concepts to data, data integration, identifying variables and variable schemas, harmonizing data, and data production, that the use of variable registries, which is something that Steve's going to talk about. If we translate these things into population science, we can use FAIR vocabularies, to find data about something specific, like infant mortality. We can use them to compare infant mortality in data sets from multiple countries. And we can use them to harmonize data that come from different places, but may have had different but related measures. In other words, data merging and data harmonization are these kinds of data wrangling things that people spend a lot of time on, and FAIR data can make them simpler. To understand what we're talking about, it's useful to recognize that there are multiple levels of vocabularies in demography, as in other things. We have some vocabularies that refer to concepts like age. We have other vocabularies that refer to specific measures of the concept, like age at last birthday or age group. Each of those measures can have a list of codes or values. And then when we've got things that are measured in multiple ways, we want to have a crosswalk or a mapping that tells us how we can combine data that's been categorized in different ways and finding a kind of a common denominator code mapping. One of the things that I was impressed by when I looked at what's going on in demography is that it seems to me that data harmonization is becoming more difficult rather than easier. A good example is marital status, which is a basic demographic variable. 50 years ago, people only talked about 4 categories for marital status: single, married, divorced, and widowed. The latest Eurostat code list has 27 categories, including things like consensual union and registered partnership. So data harmonization is actually becoming more difficult. FAIR vocabularies make this kind of harmonization possible. So suppose you wanted to look at the population aged 18 to 24 in many different countries. So if you had FAIR vocabularies with persistent identifiers that were used in the data sets, you could discover data sets by looking for the persistent identifiers of population and age. Then you could look for files that use categories that can be combined into 18 to 24. So you can tell the difference between a data set that uses single years of age, which you can aggregate up, and one that uses 5-year age groups that you can't aggregate up. And you could do all of this by writing a simple program rather than having to look yourself at each single data set or each codebook for the data set. So we talk in the report about the ecosystem of demographic data, and there are really two communities that produce data in somewhat different ways. There's on one hand an international community of that produces national statistics and aggregates them into international comparison. This community consists of national statistical agencies in every country, and then international organizations like the UN, OECD, ILO, that bring these things together. That community depends on a metadata standard, which is known as SDMX, which grew out of the need to agree on how the data should be produced and described. And Abdullah will tell us more about SDMX in a few minutes. There's also a large community, especially in the academic world, that produces microdata from surveys. There's a metadata standard for describing that kind of data as well, which goes by the acronym DDI. Unlike the international statistical world, the microdata world is extremely decentralized and uncoordinated. DDI actually was developed not by data producers, but by data repositories, and is widely used by the data archives in Europe, who use the CESDA standard, by those in the US who are members of the DataPass Coalition, by Dataverse, which is a technology for doing data archives, and is adopted by other places, including Australia and South Africa. So as I said a minute ago, SDMX was created in the first place to standardize the exchange of data between national statistical agencies and international organizations. SDMX has established registries that are used to share data and metadata. They distribute SDMX concepts like code lists and data structure definitions. And there is an SDMX global registry for cross-domain artifacts, which I'll let Abdullah talk about more. SDMX is actually very close to FAIR. The SDMX registries use common APIs that they all share. There's a lot of sharing of software in the SDMX community. SDMX registries assign URNs, which are different than URIs, but are close. They're not yet, they have identifiers, but they're not yet resolvable identifiers. The other thing that we learned about the SDMX community is that the SDMX community is moving towards establishing federated registries that will link all the registries together. From my point of view, SDMX is still more rooted in data exchange than data sharing. And so, for example, code lists are not always coordinated across data aggregators. And it's still, the APIs are extremely powerful, but it still requires some knowledge of SDMX to use them. In the DDI world, metadata is mostly created at data repositories. And if you get the data at the end, after everything's been done, at that point, it's very difficult to apply controlled vocabularies. There are a number of international surveys that are especially in demography, that are created for comparison, such as the demographic and health surveys. And those surveys are easy to harmonize. They're built harmonized already. But there are also a lot of surveys that use related or similar measures and are uncoordinated, which requires a considerable amount of effort to bring them together. Now, vocabularies and tools in this community are developing. DDI has a version of metadata called Lifecycle that is designed to make creating surveys easier and to use metadata from the beginning of the survey. And Steve will be talking about that. And we also, CESDA, the Association of Social Science Data Archives in Europe, is doing a lot of interesting things. And one of the things we heard about was the European Language Social Science Thesaurus, which is a multilingual thesaurus of social science concepts and built to be fair. We also talked a good bit about the IPPMS project, which is a very unique project. IPPMS was created to harmonize census microdata, first in the United States, and now does that work for more than 100 countries. And it also has moved on to other data sets that it harmonized. And one of the key things that IPPMS does is that it creates crosswalks between different coding schemas, which is very, very important work. Now, one of the interesting things is that IPPMS specializes in microdata, but the same data that IPPMS distributes as microdata is distributed by the UN and other organizations as aggregate data using SDMX. So one of the interesting possibilities is that IPPMS crosswalks could actually be used to harmonize SDMX data flows and combine them with the microdata at IPPMS. So another reason that we need to work on this in demography is that if we don't produce vocabularies for demographic terms, somebody else will. And I did a little test of this using two concepts, fertility and fecundity, where I looked at 19 online vocabularies. And what I found was that 7 of those vocabularies followed the definitions of these two terms used in demography, and 12 reversed the meanings. Now, in demography, fertility is actual reproduction or performance, and fecundity is the ability or capacity to reproduce. But in the medical sciences, they've reversed the definitions of those terms. And a majority of the online vocabularies have the opposite definitions to what we use in demography. So there is some urgency in getting our versions of a vocabulary out there. So that brings me to the recommendations. And the primary recommendation we have for IUSSP is that IUSSP create a FAIR Vocabulary of Demography. And that means creating something that has that not only has definitions, but has an online presence using certain kinds of technologies. Fortunately, IUSSP actually has a long history of producing a multilingual dictionaries of demography. This is a picture of the latest version of Demopedia, and I was very pleased to see that the editor of Demopedia, Nicholas Brouard, is on the call today. These dictionaries go back to the 1950s, and they were started upon request from the UN Population Division and have been produced in partnership between IUSSP and the UN Population Division ever since. And I'm happy to say that the UN Population Division has already expressed its support for creating a FAIR Vocabulary of Demography. We also have some ideas about the ways that SDMX, that the FAIR Vocabulary of Demography can reach out to SDMX and DDI and make it easier for those communities to use the demography. And we also argue that we should be promoting data harmonization and publicizing standards. And there's also a discussion of the governance necessary for a fair vocabulary in the report. For SDMX, we have some recommendations, which I think Abdullah is going to talk about a little bit more, but I think the main one is that SDMX needs to take a couple more steps to become fully fair. We have similar advice for the DDI Alliance. The DDI Alliance has an idea about creating registries, and which we think should be promoted. And also we strongly encourage that people who collect survey data and the like use persistent identifiers from the very beginning. Finally, we think it would be an enormous contribution to the whole field if IPUMS makes its metadata fair. If IPUMS code lists and code mappings would had persistent identifiers and had APIs to access them, it would make a big step towards reducing the costs of reusing data and combining data. IPUMS data is terrific and can be easily combined within the IPUMS work, among the files that IPUMS has created, but we think that work should be available for others to combine IPUMS data with other data and to use with other kinds of data. Finally, one of the things that troubles me that I see on the horizon is that we're unlikely to get a single centralized registry for vocabularies in the population sciences. Both SDMX and DDI are moving to systems of federated registries. And one of the things that will happen is that identical concepts and variables will have different identifiers in the different registries. So what we need is work that will find ways to combine those things across registries so that persistent identifiers that are really measuring the same thing will have ways of being combined. And so we're encouraging both IUSSP and CODATA to promote research on that and the development of tools for linking items across vocabularies. So I do want to thank the leadership of both IUSSP and CODATA for their tremendous support for our work, and to thank Arifan and Steve, who were terrific co-chairs. We had a number of excellent consultants whose names are mentioned in the report, and I'm happy to show the names of all of the members of the working group here. So thank you very much, and I'll return the floor to Simon.
Thank you very much, George. That's an excellent overview of the report and its context and content, and those recommendations are really important. Without further ado, I'll hand over to the next speaker, which, as I said, is Abdullah Gozalov from the UN Statistics Division. Abdullah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon, and many thanks to IUSSP and CODATA and George for their support, for leading this working group, and for giving me a chance to participate in this meeting. So I will run a presentation on the statistical data and metadata exchange standard and how it's related to the to this working group. 1 second, let me share my screen. I think the Zoom interface has changed a bit since I last used it. Okay, here. Can you see my presentation? Yes.
Yes, we can. That's perfect. Thanks, Sambir.
All right, thank you. So what is the statistical data and metadata exchange? It is a standard. It was initiated almost 20 years ago by 7 international agencies: the Bank for International Settlements, European Central Bank, Eurostat, OECD, IMF, the UN, and the World Bank. It was, very importantly, it was endorsed by the UN Statistical Commission as a preferred standard for statistical data and metadata exchange. It was certified as an ISO standard, and it has gone through several major version releases. The current version is 3.0, released about 2 years ago. And the website, the authoritative website for SDMX is sdmx.org. So what is it used for? It is used for the global data exchange as well as dissemination of statistical data. It is, as George said, rooted in data exchange, but actually dissemination is growing very rapidly. And it covers various statistical subject matter domains, such as national accounts, the macroeconomic statistics, national accounts, balance of payments, FDI, SIA, but also sustainable development goals and the other subject matter domains. There is a joint, not global, but more sort of regional data collection of demographic data, joint between Eurostat and UNSD, which has moved to SDMX. And as I said, dissemination has been growing very rapidly thanks to really wonderful and extremely powerful tools and platforms developed for SDMX. And in this context, the publication of standardized concepts and code lists at the global registry promotes its dissemination and promotes harmonization. Okay, so what does this offer? What does SDMX offer? It is a set of, at its core, is a set of technical standards, really IT low level, I would say, specifications of protocols, data and metadata formats, APIs, and so forth. Then there are statistical guidelines. Here is where standardized terminology. There is an SDMX glossary that encompasses terms not just related to SDMX, but also general statistical terms. Standardized code lists, standardized concepts, and so on, as well as guidelines for the data exchange and dissemination. And finally, tools, which are developed by various organizations. Almost all tools are free to use, and they greatly assist in areas such as structure design and maintenance, and data mapping, conversion, transmission, dissemination, and so on. So here's where it probably gets interesting to the statistician. So the SDMX statistical guidelines or content-oriented guidelines, they facilitate mutual understanding of the content of SDMX data sets. And this part is not an ISO standard, and these are guidelines and not requirements. Concepts, cross-domain concepts and code lists are recommended for use in statistical data and metadata exchange. And we have sex, age, reference area, observation status, and others. And as much as possible, these cross-domain artifacts are based on international classifications. And global structures, in the meantime, are developed. Global data structures are developed for the exchange of statistical data and metadata for various subject matter domains. And you may ask, at the beginning, I listed some of the areas where global exchanges was taking place. You may ask, why is it not taking place in others? Well, because there are no global structures available for them yet, and several global structures are under development. So we hope that we'll see them soon, and we expect that automated exchange will expand to cover many other subject matter domains in addition to those already for which global data structures already exist. So the SDMX Global Registry, mentioned already by George, is a repository of global and cross-domain artifacts, such as concepts and code lists and data structures, data flows, constraints, and data. It is available at the web address registry.sdmx.org. Here is basically, this is the repository for the statistical guide for the global data exchange structures on the one hand, and cross-domain artifacts, including concepts and code lists on the other. So you will see that standardized concepts and code lists are stored here. And unfortunately, for many statistical concepts and code lists, there is no international standard available. And we do try to create code lists and concepts that are match international classifications. One story I can say is that in 2020, the UN Statistical Commission finally approved a classification for the degree of urbanization. And as soon as it was approved, a code list was created and published at SDMX at the global registry, and it can now be used in data exchange. So if we're talking about SDMX-based data dissemination, it's growing very rapidly, I would say, because there are very powerful platforms created that have been created recently, and they really improve the efficiency and save a lot of costs when creating a statistical data warehouse. So the Cambodia's national data warehouse, which is hosted at the UN Global Platform, which was created with the assistance of the UN Statistics Division, as well as OECD, UNICEF, and Paris 21. The Italian Statistical Data Hub, the Thai National Dissemination Platform, they are all based on SDMX. All these websites work off of SDMX APIs, and they're based on software such as very popular platforms, such as the .stat suite, which is the case for Cambodia and Thailand, the ISTAT SDMX toolkit, which is the case for Italy. All these platforms are fully multilingual, and they offer a variety of visualizations. All of the data published there are machine readable by design and by default, and they're available at the SDMX API. Not just data, I should mention, but also structures. So is SDMX fair? Well, the SDMX metadata is certainly findable and accessible and interoperable and reusable, but there are a couple of issues that need to be addressed. And I think that the principal problem is that SDMX identifiers are not resolvable. SDMX uses URNs, universal resource names, for artifacts and individual items. They follow a specific format, but they are not resolvable. They are URNs, not URLs. And what is interesting here is, as a byproduct of the RESTful API, as the code lists and concept schemes stored at the global registry, they can be said to have global identifiers and resolvable, which is simply a query to the global registry API. It is unique, it is global, and it is resolvable. But this is a byproduct. It was not its primary purpose, and individual items such as codes and concepts, they unfortunately cannot be addressed that way. So implementation of these global, unique, resolvable identifiers is the most important step to making SDMX artifacts fair, and a very important one. Then another area that should be looked into, and we are looking into, is the semantic web. The RDF, specifically the RDF data queue specification has existed for years, but has not been taken advantage of until now, not in a big way. In addition, there is the SCOS and its extension XCOS. Again, something has been done there, but so far on a relatively small scale, and integration of SDMX with semantic web is definitely going to make a big difference. And in that context, what looks very interesting is a collaboration that the UN Statistics Division has just started with Google, with a view to publishing data from the UN Statistics Division as well as across the UN system at the data commons. So this collaboration looks very, very promising and interesting, and hopefully will lead to a wider adoption of, well, definitely will lead to, I think, better integration of SDMX and semantic web. So I won't go too deep into benefits of making SDMX fair. Clearly, there's improved interoperability, which is what SDMX is all about, improved discovery, thanks to semantic web and others. They're obvious. What is less obvious is it will be easier and more efficient to create data structures for data exchange or dissemination. And again, this, I think, will go a long way to help address the issue of multiple code lists being used for the same topic. Generally, with SDMX, a big issue is legacy structures and legacy applications. Because data structures are created at a particular point for specific data exchange needs, and while they try to make use of all the available cross-domain artifacts, I mean, life doesn't stand in place. You create a data structure, you use it for data exchange, and in the meantime, the world moves on, and 2 years later, a code list appears, for example, for the degree of urbanization. And then your users, your reporters, and consumers, they are already, set up their systems to consume the data with these particular codes they create. They have dependency on the codes and concepts that you use, so you can't easily go back on those. And I think that making SDMX vocabularies fair will simplify, will improve the interoperability, and will simplify bringing the legacy systems, improving the interoperability with legacy data exchange structures. So a very quick announcement. Oh dear, I just realized I wrote the 2022 SDMX Global Conference. No, it's 2023 SDMX Global Conference. Jeez, still seems I'm stuck in the past year. So it will take place, the SDMX Global Conference is a biennial event that takes place in odd years. 2019, we had a conference in Budapest. That was the last conference held in person. Then in 2021, we had to had the conference online. So this year it will take in person again. in Bahrain between the 29th of October and the 2nd of November. And this is really a global event open to anyone to participate, anyone related to data. And it's a national statistical offices, central banks, international agencies, academia, private sector are all very welcome to participate. It will focus on topics like implementation of SDMX 3.0, open source software tools, and other topics, and very importantly, and quite related to FAIR, is data and metadata governance. I think generally that governance of in SDMX is a strong side, but as the data exchange grows, so that's the need for improved governance. And if you go to sdmx2023.org, you will find more information about the global conference. And this is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abdullah, for that comprehensive view of SDMX and the need for FAIR terminologies in relation to that standard. The last of the presentations is Steve McEachen, Director of the Australian Data Archive. Over to you.
Thanks, Simon. I'll just bring on some screen share as well. Okay, it's coming up okay?
It's coming up okay.
Yep. Okay. So
yes, there we go.
There we are. Yep, excellent. So I'm going to kind of turn to some practicalities from the point of view of looking at data collection and some of the survey data management issues that George touched upon. Just for context, this is really just to reflect on, I say, this is sort of what I do day in, day out. So that, thinking really about the practicalities of where and how this becomes quite useful. So as I say, this is purely for context to give you a sense of, where this sort of interacts with, the things that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, to sort of understand why connecting the dots here becomes, really quite important, and how we're looking to leverage some of this. So I'm, one of the things that I'm involved in is the International Social Survey Program, which is one of these large cross-national data collections. It's not as coordinated as some, but it has a fairly active data coordination program with a sort of a predetermined questionnaire and a lot of data harmonization as the output. So this means we have a role here at the Australian National University in data collection, as well as after the fact data harmonization. My main day job is running the Australian Data Archive at the Australian National University, where I am responsible for managing and disseminating survey and aggregate data collections. So a lot of the data that I received is sort of at the end of the process, and George touched upon a little bit of that as to the challenges of doing this sort of work after the fact, and actually why sort of thinking about where some of these sort of FAIR objects and the reuse of these FAIR objects could be really quite helpful. I also have a role teaching data collection methods at ANU, and so I'm familiar with how to sort of preach to the choir and sort of work with graduate and undergraduate students in understanding where we might be able to embed some of these in some of our teaching and methodological processes. And as I say, just as an acknowledgement as well, my spare time, I'm part of the DDI Alliance and the CODATA executive committees, all of which is to say fundamentally that across these experiences, a lot of what I've had experience with is the disconnection between these systems, and the capacity for enabling a lot more streamlined use of data, and actually sort of a refocusing of a lot of our efforts in the way we use and manage and process data that could be enabled by connecting the dots between some of these systems. That's really the emphasis that I'm bringing to here. Probably I'll put a greatest emphasis on the data documentation, which is the DDI program that I have the most heavily involvement with, but there are connections into some of the other environments as well. So to kind of sort of start the story here, what I want to work our way through is, well, where can we sort of leverage some of the recommendations? And I'm going to touch upon the DDI recommendations specifically for how this might be possible to do. There are very broad frameworks for managing survey data collection in the statistical world. The general statistical business process model is probably the best known of these, and it actually has a fairly well articulated framework for looking at a reference framework for looking at sort of the stages in the data production process. Most academic research programs are not as structured as this in real life. So we have to kind of be able to accommodate the different ways people work and the different degrees of resources and sort of capabilities that people can bring to the table, and as to how we might make best use of some of the infrastructure that we'd be able to that we might be able to build. But if we think a bit about actually where we use vocabularies in our day-to-day practice, right across the board, they actually pop up in quite a lot of areas in the data production and data analysis process, both in academic and statistical data production. And in spaces that we probably don't think about necessarily, but actually they become fairly important, in underpinning quite a lot of the work that we do in quite a lot of different ways. If we think about, if we, sort of the frameworks we might use, sort of the methods and concepts, we can, tie them back into research designs, our concepts and our hypotheses. We leverage vocabularies, classifications, definitions, standardized definitions, and so forth. In the data design and collection of data, we're using, vocabularies in quite small but heavily used vocabularies and response domains to the questions that we ask, and we might be building out variable and question banks that we are able to leverage from that. Some of those might be those that we build ourselves. A questionnaire is any questionnaire is potentially reusable in future work. The variables and the data dictionaries that we produce are also embedded. Include embedded vocabularies, even agree disagree scales, yes nos. The more we can say they sound like simple interventions, the more we can standardize those, actually the more we can facilitate their reuse, particularly between machines, which is really the emphasis of this program. We can leverage them in sampling, and stratifications of sample designs are often stratified along standard classifications for sample frame creation and extraction, for talking to sample frames, sample databases. Where particularly we're going to use and reuse classifications, which is a very large, structured and authoritative vocabulary. When we're doing a lot of data coding, think here, for example, of data, occupational coding, or the ICD definitions for health and so forth. So a lot of those data processing activities where we're trying to align with local or national, international standards, make heavy use of standard vocabularies. In analysis, in creating aggregates, George mentioned those, distributions by age or by sex, or by whichever demographic, often to compare with national averages as well. For doing subsetting, for doing modeling and standardized covariates. Any of these have the potential for being able to reuse a lot of these vocabularies in different ways. And there's sort of a layered approach we can look at to where we might be able to make good use of those vocabularies in useful ways. But what we need is to be able to embed them in a lot of the systems that we use. So I'm going to use sort of the basic structure of a question and a variable to really kind of articulate where some of our interventions might be useful to take place, and some of the work that we're actually how that ties into the recommendations that the group has developed, and some of the work that I've been doing to sort of point out where this can occur in relatively simple ways that can actually have fairly important consequences. If we think about this, so this comes from the IUSSP, the International Social Survey Program. This is one of the standardized questions that gets asked in the IUSSP. And the idea here is It's going to be translated into multiple languages, but it's the source questionnaire for connecting as the basis of an item around your main labour market status, for want of a better terminology. So there's a measurement goal. There's an underlying concept that that's sitting here, and some suggested some standardized responses that go into the questionnaire, and also appear in the variable and a lot of the processing work that actually happens. So we can put some framing around that to actually structure that up, quite simply. We can have a variable that might appear in a column in a tabular data set. We have a question which we can standardize, which the following best describes your current situation. We have a standardized response domain for categories and codes. And we even have, as I mentioned, an underlying concept that sits behind the question. So it's really tying back to a research question, research agenda that someone may have. So we might be interested in looking at the relationship of employment status and some health outcome, as an example there. But each of these has some structures that we can essentially articulate, embed, and reuse. And we do reuse questions, variables, response domains, and sort of in positivist sort of frameworks on a regular basis. But we don't do a very good job of actually capturing them and being able to reuse them from one system to one mechanized system to the next. We do this work as academic work, but we don't always pass that information through effectively for it to be reused on a machine-to-machine basis, which is where we're going to get a lot of the value, and it really ties into that FAIR agenda, the accessible, interoperable, and reusable agenda. So we have all these concepts everywhere, and we know these that these exist, and we make active use of them in our academic work. So just highlighting, if we look down the table, the question I just presented earlier, there's about 10 or 11 different research concepts that we could potentially want to define. And then they might appear in standardized vocabularies or standardized glossaries. Demopedia, for example, in demography. Similarly, they might appear in international classifications and so forth. Unemployment is regularly defined. But how do we make sure that we actually for a human and for an academic, it's easy for us to be able to make that translation and say, okay, I see what's going on there. If we're to move sort of along our agenda, particularly to be able to scale up a lot of the work that we want to do, we have to move beyond that, unfortunately. Say humans can make that interpretation, machines cannot. So we have to find means of connecting the dots. So DDI, Documentation Initiative, has done some of that work in being able to describe some of those structures. All of those terminologies that the framings, questions, variables, etc., that I sort of mentioned previously are reflected in some of the standards that we use. Are also able to connect between DDI and SMX and other standards as well. But we need more. We need some other foundation work to be done to be able to connect the dots between those systems. So fundamentally, we need to be able to connect humans to machines and machines to each other. Why? Humans make errors, and we tend to make errors fairly regularly. And I'm going to reflect upon my own practice here. Machines can identify differences between things, and can read and review things very quickly and process information very quickly, but they can't interpret what those differences are, or at least they can't just yet. So I could think here of a copy paste error. For example, a machine can pick up that there's a difference between the two things. It can't tell you why there's any difference. A human will make a mistake in translating those two things, but can readily identify why the differences exist. The human-to-human interaction isn't going to be something that can scale particularly effectively. The machine-to-machine interaction is one that can, but we've got to provide the foundations there for them to be able to do that. Then, to give you an example here, this is a simple harmonisation of work that we were doing with the Australian Survey of Social Attitudes, which say here's a simple mistake that we made in processing between 1 year and the next. By taking commas out of out of one variable label and not putting in the next one, we lose reusability. I say the human can go, oh look, it's very clear that those two are the same things. A machine will go, what do I do with this? And until it gets an instruction about what to do, maybe we can progressively do something with this with machine learning. But until we move to that point, that difference is something that has to be resolved. So we have to find means of actually trying to minimize the probability of this actually occurring in the first place, or develop systems that allow us to process this, this sort of error in an effective way. And this is a simple data harmonization problem. It's very clear to us looking at this as humans. How do we train machines to be able to either do the same thing, but train humans not to make this mistake in the first place is the problems that we're trying to deal with. So we also have to move to solve a second problem, which is often the content, and George sort of reflected this as well, is not that we need to be able to do a lot of this processing isn't accessible in machine processable form. This is the accessible, findable and accessible part of the FAIR vocabularies. PDFs are great for humans. They're easy to read. They're printable. Excellent for humans. They're useful for machine. Statistics progressively has moved its content electronically, but it's all in HTML. Again, nice for humans to read, easy readable, content rich, but a human, but it's not consistent. So machines, it's not reusable. We need to be moving to environments, and this is the sort of that FAIR agenda. What do we need to put in place in order to be able to allow this to occur? So this is where the recommendations for the DDI Alliance really, came to. So there were 3 recommendations there: develop practices and guidelines for registries of vocabularies, variables, and data domains. All those things that I presented. How do I reproduce a question in another system? How do we encourage the use of persistent identifiers from the beginning of the life cycle? And how do we enable that data harmonization to actually occur in an effective way? So let's look at some examples that we've been working on. Each of these things are actually doable, but as I say, there's quite a bit of technology and quite a lot of data and information curation needs to happen behind the scenes to allow that to occur. And different parts of the ecosystem are going to have to do some of this work to enable that to be possible. So in developing guidelines and practices for registries, what are some of the parts we need to put in place? At ADA, we've been working on a project with a number of partners in Australia around what might be a model of data and metadata exchange to allow those systems to talk to each other. And it kind of is based upon 4 basic parts. You need some sort of registry or vocabulary service, which is the top of this triangle here. Ignore the details on the slide here. The key thing is the 4 boxes in the middle. You need a vocabulary service which allows you to go and get reference material. Where can I go and get an authoritative set of information? George was concerned about those registries proliferating. We need some place where we can go and look ideally for the definition where possible. Demopedia hopefully gets the same. We need to be able to move it into services that allow us to support data collection. So we do have quite a lot of standardized versions of these. Qualtrics, Lime Survey, REDCap, fairly actively used across a lot of academic communities, that you can roll your own systems as well. But if we can move those standardized questions into systems, we can enable that effectively. We need to be able to move them into processing spaces, the research environment services where we process data. Probably we need to be able to move data in, effectively in and out of often sensitive data environments, possibly remote processing environments. And then we need to be able to store them away and put them away effectively. And that's ADA's role, is move them into an archive where you can go and find them the next time. And we need to be able to provide interaction between each of those systems. So we can see what the constituent parts might be, and we've been working a little bit on seeing, how might we go about that. Vocabulary registries certainly exist, and we've had a couple mentioned already. One of the examples in the working paper is the ELST vocabulary. CESDA, is the Consortium of European Social Science Data Archives, has variable registries in development. The harder one is actually the question registries. There are fewer of those around. In Australia, we've also got a Research Vocabularies Australia, which is a national service for providing research vocabularies. And we'd be able to, for example, make available the census a selection of the census dictionary from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, available as a demonstrator through this service as well. We're working on a politics one and others. That allows us to actually address those human versus machine readable services. So we've got a human readable version where you can do a lookup, and it gives you a sort of a basic search of terminologies, for example, of occupational codes. But it also provides the services the machines need to be able to interact with them. So the SCOS, JSON, which is the JavaScript object notation, a lot of web developers like, Turtle, which a lot of linked data people like. And it also allows you to go down to very fine-grained codes and categories. So the infrastructure, the services are there, but we've got to be able to curate the information effectively to embed those in these systems. Variable and value domain registries have in the DDI community have been fairly well established now, particularly around the DDI lifecycle framework that George mentioned. Collectica in particular is a company in the US who established quite a lot of registry service, metadata registries for enabling variable and value domain information to be able to be presented to the world. There is some increasingly some challenge with enabling that to be persistent, but the services are there. The next phase of that work is now the cross-domain integration standard, which is the next phase of the DDI release, which is also moving into other data formats as well. All of these use the DDI variable cascade model, which is a key part of the system that we need there. The other two parts that we need, we have to look at how we persist identifiers. Setting up these registries so they can actually address the machine-machine persistence is something of a challenge, and Abdullah kind of reflected on that. Where and how can we do this? We can embed them in concept identifiers. We can think about embedding them in survey questions. We can even do it in data cleaning. So we've had a simple example of that to say, well, could we connect an existing vocabulary to an existing data collection instrument? So this is Lime Survey, the data collection service software that we use. What does it take to actually sort of create those connections between services if you have those registries available? Well, we can import a question from an external service. We can create the question. We can make sure that we got a link to the question in the question source there. We've just been experimenting with this. There is our persistent identifier. Not quite persistent, that's not quite true, but it is possible to create that connection. And there is all of our standardized codes and categories now embedded in a new questionnaire to maintain those connections across time. For harmonization, we're getting towards that as well. George has suggested XCOS and SCOS and how to support linking of persistent identifiers. Well, we actually have a lot of the sort of resources there available there as well. A lot of the standards already exist. SCOS and SCOS concepts sort of underpin quite a lot of the systems that we use. Between DDI, SDMX, and SCOS, we probably have quite a lot of the pieces we need to be able to bring together in terms of standards. The hard part now, and this is particularly the case in the microdata world, is we need the implementations in the software we use in data collection and analysis. How would we reuse that information effectively? And we actually then need to go ahead and identify and reuse what others have already done. So we have to use those services that are around and make those connections like those that I just pointed to in the data collection. And that's where I'll leave it there. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks very much, Steve, and thanks for accelerating through those recommendations there at the end. So now a quick hop across town in Canberra, I understand, to Edith Gray, who's a member of the IUSSP Council. Edith, we'd like to invite you to share your reflections on the report and what IUSSP can make of it.
Thanks very much, Simon. Yes, my name is Edith Gray. I'm a council member of IUSSP, and I was the IUSSP Council Liaison for the IUSSP-CODATA Working Group on FAIR Vocabularies in Population Research. And in that role, I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak about why the FAIR Vocabularies report is important for IUSSP and to outline what IUSSP will do with the recommendations. So the IUSSP's mission is to promote the scientific study of population, to encourage exchange between researchers around the globe, and to stimulate interest in population issues. And to this end, the IUSSP supports panels like the FAIR Vocabularies in Population Research Working Group to advance the field of demography. As noted in the report, the IUSSP has been a strong supporter of accessibility to data and data quality. One example is the Demopedia multilingual demographic dictionaries, which are concerned with defining and standardising demographic terms. And this has proved to be, well, hopefully will be a resource which will be invaluable to the future objective of creating a FAIR vocabulary of demography. Another example is from 2014, where the IUSSP convened a meeting to discuss how demographers and their demographic skills, including their ability to assess and evaluate data quality, can contribute to what was then known as the data revolution. That meeting highlighted that understanding data quality and interoperability is a crucial aspect of the process of producing, analysing and interpreting data to meet the data revolution's end goal. So as you can see, the subject matter of FAIR vocabularies is close to the heart of IUSSP. Data are vital and comparative analysis is essential to our discipline, and the vocabularies can play a key role here. So we at IUSSP were very happy to be able to collaborate with the CODATA group from the International Science Council over the last few years through this joint panel on FAIR vocabularies to better understand the role we can play at IUSSP. As you've heard, the terms of reference of the panel was to provide recommendations on how to make demographic data fair, accessible, interoperable and reusable to account for emerging standards and technologies. The recommendations for IUSSP are firstly to develop a FAIR vocabulary of demography in partnership with other stakeholders. Secondly, to increase adoption by data providers to provide outreach to the SDMX and DDI communities, which you've just heard about, by exporting content from the vocabulary into these formats for use by these communities. And thirdly, to promote data harmonisation. These recommendations come with a very helpful points on ways to achieve these recommendations. At the most recent council meeting, the IUSSP reviewed and discussed the recommendations provided in the report of the working group that's being launched here today. IUSSP fully endorses these recommendations and we commit to bringing this important mission forward. For this reason, the Council has decided to set up a permanent standing committee to oversee the work of FAIR vocabularies for population research, and we hope to continue the very good collaboration with CODATA in this venture. I'd like to end with a note of huge thanks for all the members of the working group, particularly its leadership from George Alter with Arifin Gregory and Steve McGecken for completing this report, and of course all the other panel members as well. And for their support of IUSSP to continue its mission to further scientific research in population issues. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Edith, and thanks for that statement of official endorsement of the report and its recommendations and the establishment of the permanent working group. So, colleagues, we have a few minutes left. Please, could you add any questions in the chat or indeed raise your hand, and I'm going to hand over to Arifin Gregory, who will chair this last part of the meeting.
Thank you, Simon. While we're waiting for other people to throw some questions into the ring, I'd like to start with one. And this is to all of the speakers up to this point. I'm pretty convinced by the findings, what's been presented today. There is a fairly urgent problem, as George showed us, and there's a lot of technology, a lot of resources out there in a structured way. What I'm scratching my head and wondering about, though, is what are the next proactive steps? Where does this set of recommendations go in terms of the organizations? Steve made the point that we have good, a lot of good technology, a lot of standards, but we also have some pretty different communities around vocabularies. I'd like to push it back to the speakers and say, what's next? How do we get these organizations to work together? Because they're pretty different communities, even though they share an interest in this space. George, can I ask you to try to answer that? What's next?
Well, so I think we've just heard a pledge by IUSSP to start on their the recommendations from them. I mean, there is certainly a chicken and egg issue here that you need to have, for these things to work, you need certain technologies that have to work together. And I actually think that because of the work that's been done over decades at IUSSP, we can get a FAIR vocabulary of demography in pretty short order and have it hosted. And then I think it's a matter of knocking on doors and getting people to comply. I think it's I was extremely pleased by the response we got from people like Abdallah and Edgardo in Griesing at the ILO and people at OECD to the committee. And so I think that I mean, I'm hoping that having something endorsed by IUSSP and CODATA will give Abdallah something that he can, show to the powers that be at the UN statistics division and saying, yeah, we should get behind this. So, and I think that in the DDI world, the survey world that Steve was describing, these things are actually coming along. Steve mentioned Collectica, and Collectica actually builds in a metadata registry. It's built into the project, the product, and Collectica is catching on in a number of places. I don't think so much in the US, but certainly in Europe and other places. So I think that there will gradually be, we're at a point, I am hopeful, Arifan, that we're at a turning point. I must say that in other things in the data space, I have been amazed at how quickly some things move. The amount of energy that's being devoted to work on FAIR is quite amazing, and data sharing requirements by journals. I started working on that 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, and for the first couple of years, I thought I was, shouting into the wilderness, but suddenly things moved quickly. So, I guess I'm by nature an optimist, but I think that we've, I'm hopeful that the report is a first step that people can use in various organizations to say, yeah, there's a clear path for this, and we should start working on it.
So thank you, George. I want to put Abdallah on the hot seat now. Abdallah, I'm very curious to know, because I think that the presentation you gave was right on, and you talked about some of the key issues for SDMX. Do you see the SDMX as an organization being receptive to these recommendations and sort of stepping up the way that George is hopefully predicting here? What's your take on that, Abdallah?
Thanks, Arfan. Thanks for the question. I think I'm optimistic about that. Where I mean, the problem, of course, is that SDMX is a consortium of various international agencies, each with their own needs and views and takes. So it's often not easy to reach a consensus on an issue. However, on this particular topic, I'm optimistic because for two reasons. One is that, well, actually for several reasons, more than two maybe. One is that the benefits are pretty obvious. Two is they would not be that difficult to implement in my view. It doesn't require a major release. It doesn't require, enormous research to identify the best ways how to get there. So it's fairly simple. And finally, the endorsement by IUSSP and CODATA, I think, is figures in there, as George said. So I am optimistic that these features will be implemented in the standard.
Is there anything proactive that we could do to engage with the SDMX community? You mentioned the next global conference coming up in Bahrain. Is there something that IUSSP and CODATA or DDI or anybody else could do to help promote that collaboration?
Absolutely, absolutely. For example, make a presentation at the global conference and stress the connection of SDMX, not just, and I think that why I love this working group and being a part of it is that it brings together multiple communities, including beyond SDMX. Because the integration of SDMX with other standards, in particular DDI, it's been talked about for years, but not much has been done so far. So I hope that this will prove to be a catalyst around which other initiatives will coalesce. And again, I think that the benefits of making SDMX fully FAIR are very obvious, and it's a very important topic.
Thank you, Abdullah. Steve, I'm going to put you in the hot seat now for a minute. There's a lot of talk here about registries, and you talk about Collectica, but none of that is organized. That's just different institutions putting up their metadata online. How do you see that playing out in specifically within the DDI space and the social science research space? Because I think that's a bit of a challenge that they don't face with SDMX in some other areas.
Yeah. I think that's one that's still to be resolved. DDI has a sort of a framework for looking at, how we might set up registry services in a federated way. So there has been some work done within the DDI community around this. How that plays out on the ground, I think, is still to be determined at this point. Still needs a bit more work as to, technically speaking, does the implementation work for the needs that we have? I think the other, but I would be optimistic there that can be resolved. The other question we have, though, is really connecting, the infrastructure around, describing surveys and describing, describing data is probably coming along pretty well, but how do we connect that to the research community in effective ways, I think, is the other key part that's there. And that's sort of why I started with research questions and concepts in the first place, and really where I'd like to I'd like to see the connections into the Demopedia and other resources is, there's a reason we ask all these survey questions, and certainly in the academic community, which is we want to answer research questions. So what's the relationship between, the questions on the ground and actually the research we do? We write this down in unstructured forms in the papers that we publish. We all have a method section, a measurement section in our papers. But we don't yet really connect the dots effectively between the academic thinking, the intellectual thinking, and the data collection on the ground. And it's bridging that gap. And I think it's partly a linked data gap, but partly also, if we can have, standard ways of measuring things, if we have recommended questions and so forth, that is one means of addressing that as well.
So you see that like the working group at IUSSP and the work between IUSSP and CODATA as possibly helping connect those communities, Steve? I mean, I guess I'd love to hear suggestions from anybody about specifically what are the next steps? We look at these recommendations. How do these organizations keep working together? Because I'm convinced that the pieces are on the table, Steve. But I think you're right. The problem is this has to be driven by the research world and the statistical world, not by the technology world. And I'm still not clear. We put these pieces in place. Okay, how do we make them really work for people? And I'd be curious to hear anybody's input on that. George, did you unmute purposefully there?
Yeah. So I think that I think it's already happening, and one of our mutual friends, Frank Carton, who works for, for INSEE in France, has been doing, a lot of stuff, introducing SCOS and persistent identifiers in the SDMX world in which he lives. And I think that he's got working examples of these things that I think will have an impact if, as people get to know them. And our role on this report was to try to call attention to these things.
So it looks like we have a comment here from Nicholas Broward. I don't know if you want to say something aloud here, Nicholas. Can you unmute and speak?
No, thank you very much. So it's just a comment because I'm listening for you for the first time. So, and what I'm surprised a little bit that the language question, which was raised by the multilingual demographic dictionary in the late 50s by the UN, the most important question was languages. And now English is spoken everywhere. And so I think that DDI or all this what you are discussing today is linked to no more linked to languages. English will be the language we are discussing on, but in fact, when you are doing sociological surveys and you want to compare them, for example, for health expectancy or disability, the main question in comparability is still linked to languages, to how people interpret the questions. So maybe we did some improvement, but the huge difference that we have in share, for example, in Europe, are coming from the language. So I don't know if you didn't speak of these language differences today because it's not the aim. I think it's not no more your aim, or if it is missing. So that's my comment.
Yeah. So Arfan, if I could just say briefly that.
Absolutely, George. Go ahead.
So Nicola, I didn't mention afterwards. I thought I should mention it, but one of the things you should know is that the technology for FAIR vocabularies has multilingual abilities built in. So one of the things that we will be able to do in transferring all the work that you did on Demopedia into a new FAIR version is that it will incorporate all of the language connections that you made. In fact, the way that Demopedia is organized and the way that the multilingual dictionaries before it were organized makes that very easy. So I want to assure you that as we move forward to putting all that work onto a new platform, that it will have all of the language abilities. The platform we're moving to is designed in a way to allow multiple languages, and it fits very well with the way that the multilingual dictionaries were structured from the very beginning. And you'll find in the report that there's a little description of that history. So thank you for this question. It's something that I meant to mention and didn't.
Thank you, George.
If I could, yes, very quickly. Actually, structured formats such as SDMX and DDI, they lend themselves very easily, very well to automated translation. In fact, UNSD and the World Bank have jointly led a project on automated translation of SDG reference metadata, which was completed. So the automated process is in place. It's not automatic, it's automated, so that a human reviewer submits an artifact such as a code list for translation, then reviews the results. The important part here is that because these formats are structured, it greatly simplifies the process of automated translation, of setting up automated translation, and improves the quality. You can write routines and scripts. You know what format to expect. So this is definitely already part of the SDMX world. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah. Steve, did you have a comment on this question?
Yeah, I do. I just wanted to say, Nicola, I think you were talking about the differences between English and other languages. I'd suggest that as the Australian who's often in the room with an Englishman and an American, I can tell you it exists just as much in English as it does in dealing with other languages. In fact, it might be easier. We once spent, I remember a conversation of 30 minutes in a room discussing the term welfare and its implications for multiple, so the non-English speakers in the room, or the non-native English speakers, are having just as much fun dealing with the Australian in the room.
Thank you. So we have another question in the chat, and I think this leads a little bit from what you were talking about, Abdullah. Do we think that emerging AI systems such as ChatGPT might help with extracting and coding data that are in old papers, reports, etc., or are they not yet trustworthy enough? You can do a lot of things with AI today, but is it worthwhile? And that's I think a pretty timely question, especially dealing with the kind of legacy that has been mentioned by a couple of our speakers. George, do you want to start off on that?
Yeah, so I almost put it into my talk, but I actually put a question to ChatGPT where I asked it to combine data by marital status and age from as many countries as possible, and using 5-year age groups. And what ChatGPT sent me this very nice reply that said, yeah, I'd like to help, but I can't because you have to do this manually. And it's, it pointed me to Eurostat and a couple of other places. So, on one level, creating a FAIR vocabulary of demography and all this other thing will be very good for ChatGPT, because ChatGPT will be able to do work that it can't do now. But more broadly, I think the question is about is, from Jeff, is are there ways that things like machine learning and natural language processing can help? And the answer to that is yes. I have, from a previous project, I have friends who work in the biomedical community using NLP to disambiguate things. And there's been a tremendous amount of work in that area that could be applied. Now, how far it will get, I don't know, but I think that whether we, certainly at the beginning, we're going to need combined machine learning with human interventions, but you can still save a lot of time by using these things, and especially for this problem of harmonizing across different registries. So well, Jeff, I see you sign on. I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah, Jeff, would you like to chime in here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for context, so I'm part of the work package that's looking at agricultural biodiversity and specifically plant pollinator interactions within agriculture. So I'm sitting in on as many of these webinars as possible, just to see what we can learn across work packages. And what we have an issue which is probably common to many of the work packages in that a lot of the data that we're interested in are in hard copy or digital scans, PDFs or whatever. They're not in data repositories. And some of this is going back into the 19th century, and it's incredibly useful data for us to make, historical comparisons of how things have changed. But the actual extraction of the data is incredibly time consuming. And we know that people make errors with the data. We can look at some of the data that's that has been extracted, that is in repositories, and we can see where people have made errors there. At the same time, we know that ChatGPT makes things up. There's, social media is awash with examples of that. And I had an example of my own, in the last few months, where I asked it a question about, what did Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, what did he say about birds as pollinators? And it presented me with this poem, which sounded just like Erasmus Darwin, but actually when you follow it back, it doesn't exist. ChatGPT made it up. So, at some level, we've got to be able to trust these systems and be able to check these systems. But are they creating more work than they're saving? So I'm just kind of curious as to what the feeling in your area was as to how useful they may be.
Jeff, I know that we've seen some activity in that area, people exploring how good is ChatGPT at mining metadata from things like CSV files. And the answer is, well, it's good, but it can't be trusted yet. I think there's probably more work to be done in that area, but I don't know what other people's experience has been, but it's an interesting topic, but not one that I think we have a really solid answer for yet. I don't know if anybody else would like to chime in. We're getting a bit past our appointed slots, so should we bring this to a close, Simon? What is your feeling?
Yeah, I think it's probably about time, isn't it? I was just checking. There's a nice comment from Nico van Nijmegen, who's also on the IUSSP Council, but I think that's a comment. So yes, thanks everyone for your patience in staying on for the discussion. We ran over a little bit. I think we had 3 really excellent presentations, so I hope it was worth hanging around for that content and for the discussion then. So I'd like to close this webinar. I'd like to thank again the members of the working group, the co-chairs, the presenters today, and in particular George, who really did drive this through. I'd like to thank IUSSP for the wonderful collaboration, and it was great to have the working group as a joint project. It was great to have the report as a joint output, and to hear that enthusiastic endorsement of the report and its recommendations as a next step. I think Abdullah put it really well, that he said he really enjoyed participating in the working group because it brought together those communities, and that was one of the questions that Arafan highlighted as well. So I hope that both in this subject of demography, of other social science research areas and other disciplines as well, you've heard from Jeff, who's looking at pollinator data as part of the World Fair project, we can continue this cross-boundary, cross-domain, cross-institution collaboration, because a lot of these things are shared issues and need to be addressed together with sensitivity for the perspectives of different domains. And the internationalization and multilingualism as well that's been mentioned. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for your participation, and I'll close this meeting now.